Hello and welcome to the NIST Cybersecurity Framework Learning Series. If you haven't already, please watch the introductory videos leading into this one. It isn't required, but if you haven't had exposure to the cybersecurity framework, those videos might help you get oriented as well as introduce you to my style of teaching. Since I'm just starting out here on YouTube, I'm trying to be more effective as I progress through the series. My name is Jonathan, and in this section of the series, I'm going to talk about the govern function, its categories, subcategories, and I'm going to apply some of those to a fictional business so that you can see the entire thought process and implementation from scratch from the perspective of a small business owner. Now, when we hear the term cybersecurity framework, it can be intimidating and confusing if you're not already working in the IT space or the computer industry. There are many business types and even entire industries that are not IT-centric that would still benefit greatly by implementing some of the security controls in this framework. Now, I have a small list of some business types here that are perfect examples of places that you would not expect to have a strong cybersecurity program in place, with the exception maybe of hospitals due to the strict federal oversight, things like HIPAA and PCI compliance. Hospitals, and more importantly, the smaller private doctor clinics, they still lack the full maturity potential that they could reach by leveraging this framework. Now, think of your local church and think about how many computers or automated systems you've seen in there recently. Probably zero. Does that mean the church doesn't care about its members' information or private data? No. It's just a reflection of that business's priorities. And for a small church, cybersecurity is not high on the budget list. Check out your church's website. I bet it's pretty outdated, or at the very least, not maintained frequently. Who has access to that website? Who updates it? If it got hacked, how long would it take someone to notice? And who would handle an incident like that? Are there reporting channels for the public to report that the website was even hacked? These are the types of things we plan for and the types of things we think about when we're building out a cybersecurity program using this framework. And these concepts apply to any type of business. With the advent of the Internet of Things, IoT devices, and almost every device having network capabilities, like smart refrigerators, cybersecurity should be on everyone's radar. I'll tell some interesting stories later on in this series about how Target got hacked through its HVAC air conditioning system, and how a casino was breached through its fish tank aquarium, which happened to use a network-connected water temperature thermometer. Those are the types of things, unfortunately, that we need to start thinking about more. I guarantee that every single business type on this list has at least one network-connected device that leads back to some type of sensitive database or website that's not intended to be public. And I guarantee that if you add the word hack or breach to the end of any of them and Google it, you'll get real-world cases that have happened within the last year or two. All of these businesses have customers, which means they store some type of customer data, which means they have some way of accessing it. This lesson series is going to help you investigate who has access and how it should be accessed, along with many other types of security concepts. Now, to refocus this video back onto the govern function of the framework, in this video I won't be talking so much on the technical mechanisms used to secure the systems, but more around the policies, procedures, strategy, and oversight that guide the implementation of those technical mechanisms. Think of more management and C-level activities that drive the entire program, and not so much the configuration settings of the applications. We'll get into the weeds around that, the application configurations and encryption requirements and things of that nature in the other functions, but this video is dedicated to the govern function. If you've ever heard the acronym GRC, that stands for Governance, Risk, and Compliance. And that's what this section is all about. So if you're targeting a GRC role or studying for a certification related to GRC concepts, this section is for you. Welcome to John's Pub. Proudly nestled next door to the legendary Temple Bar and just across the cobblestone path from the Ruby Duck Cafe, the perfect spot for a proper pint, live trad sessions, and the crack of the music. Pull up a stool and join me as I share the stories, music, and atmosphere of our little corner of the city. And also some NIST cybersecurity framework concepts that can be applied to a small restaurant business structure. Slanche. Alright, that's enough roleplay for now. So this is the fictional business I came up with to help you understand how we can assess and implement some of these govern controls. I'm going to walk through them as if I'm thinking through the process for the very first time as a restaurant-minded person with very little experience or knowledge. I'll also share some insights as to what external auditors might look for if they were to come visit on site to inspect your systems. You'll notice 2 bullets at the bottom of this slide. The first bullet is if you're striving toward a specific maturity level within the cybersecurity maturity model. The second bullet is for the majority of people watching this video, new business owners and mainly non-IT audience. This is how I'm going to be presenting the functions and categories in this series. Although I will be referencing the maturity model, this framework is simply a guide of options that you can choose when you're securing your systems. The maturity score will be a byproduct of the options that you ultimately decide to implement. Okay, so let's review NIST definition of the govern function. The organization's cybersecurity risk and management strategy, expectations, and policy are established, communicated, and monitored. The govern function provides outcomes to inform what an organization may do to achieve and prioritize the outcomes of the other 5 functions in the context of its mission and stakeholder expectations. Governance activities are critical for incorporating cybersecurity into an organization's broader enterprise risk management strategy. Govern addresses an understanding of organizational context, the establishment of cybersecurity strategy and cybersecurity supply chain risk management, roles, responsibilities, and authorities, policy, and the oversight of cybersecurity strategy. And that was a mouthful, and it sounds more complicated than it is. So the categories within the govern function are as follows: organizational context, risk management strategy, roles, responsibilities, and authorities, policy, oversight, cybersecurity, supply chain, risk management. So these are each of the categories that fall under the govern function, and they get more detailed as we go. And then within that are the subcategories, which you'll see next. So on the next part of this lesson, I'm going to analyze what each of these categories mean, as well as drill down one level deeper into the subcategories. And then I'm going to see which ones that I can apply to our fictional business, the Irish Pub. But don't forget, as we go through these, if you're working at a school, movie theater, gas station, hospital, all those other industries or business types that were listed earlier, keep those top of mind while we go through these, because the thought process and the way that we implement these are more important than the specific controls themselves. So you'll see as I go through the questions I ask, just replace Irish Pub with movie theater or with convenience store, gas station, and you'll see that it's interchangeable with all of these controls. And that's the goal of this, is to get you thinking how you can plug these controls into whatever environment that you're working in or you want to work in. Now we have arrived at the meat and potatoes portion of this lesson, or for the vegans, now we have arrived at the tofu and potatoes portion of this lesson. All right, it's enough jokes. Here we have the govern function along with its categories. For the govern function, there are 6 categories that we just reviewed in the previous slide, so feel free to rewind and check it out again. But here they are: organizational context, risk management strategy, roles, responsibilities, and authorities, policy, oversight, and cybersecurity, supply chain risk management. And the category we're talking about in this slide is organizational context. The circumstances, mission, stakeholder expectations, dependencies, and legal, regulatory, and contractual requirements surrounding the organization's cybersecurity risk management decisions are understood. That was a mouthful. So from this definition, we can see that this category is addressing pretty much any legal requirements the business may have. It's intentionally written this way as a blanket statement because, as I mentioned earlier, this framework can be applied to any type of business, not just IT. So if we're running a hospital or a school, those businesses are probably going to have PCI and HIPAA requirements. If it's a movie theater, I'm not familiar with that industry, but I would imagine there's some type of copyright laws or agreements the movie theater has to comply with so nobody is pirating or bootlegging on their property. For a restaurant, for our Irish pub example, we're going to have various health-related laws and regulations to comply with. No matter what laws or regulation your business is required to comply with, this framework will plug in on top of that data in order to protect it at the appropriate levels. Even though all of these businesses and industries have different mission statements and dependencies, the cybersecurity framework can be adapted and tailored to any environment. Now I'm going to get even more granular and add one more level of detail called subcategories. But before I explain the subcategories, I want to explain the identifiers that you're seeing next to each of the functions and categories. In the far right column of this matrix, called Category Identifier, you can see what they look like when assembled together. Each function and category will be combined to create its own category identifier. In this case, we're looking at GV.OC, which represents the govern function, and then the organizational context, OC, underneath it. You can see what the other ones will look like as we move through the lesson. The next layer of identifier is called the subcategory, and that will simply add a number to the end of the category identifier. So, working under the govern function and within the organizational context category, there are 5 subcategories. None of them have names. They're only number labels that get added to the OC identifier. And you'll see going forward that each category will have anywhere between 2 and 10 subcategories underneath it. There's no hard rule about how many subcategories there are for each category. It's just the number of controls that NIST came up with for each area. And they get adjusted and added, subtracted with each revision of the framework. So on the right side of this slide, and it should be above me right now if I align this properly, you can see starting at the top the function, which is govern, GV, the category, organizational context, OC, and the subcategories, GV.OC-01 through 05. These don't have names. They're just the number and the statement itself. And these statements represent the most specific detail you can define when implementing the controls in your environment. So I'll read through them here first as is, and then my approach for the rest of this lesson is going to be to analyze the 2 most critical subcategories from every function and category to give you a really clear understanding of the thought process and the approach that you should be using when selecting and implementing these. And again, I'm going to be using the Irish pub as an example business, but you'll see the pattern as we go along, and you'll understand what to look for and how to tailor these to your own business model. I selected subcategories 03 and 05 to analyze for this example. You can use the same thought process and approach that I use for these 2 examples and apply it to others. I'll be doing this for every category so you can see the consistency across the functions, the categories, and the subcategories. So for GV.OC-03, it states legal, regulatory, and contractual requirements regarding cybersecurity, including privacy and civil liberties obligations, are understood and managed. So let's look at this one through the lens of the Irish pub. What legal or regulatory requirements would I have regarding cybersecurity? Now, I said this pub was located in Dublin, Ireland, but let's pretend I have a location in Florida, where I really am located. There's this thing called Florida's Digital Bill of Rights, FDBR, and it's a consumer privacy law. And there is a revenue threshold of $1 billion, and John's Irish Pub doesn't quite meet that threshold. But let's walk through it so you can at least understand the examples, since there are other laws and regulations that will be approached the same way, depending on your business and geographic location. So this Bill of Rights sets rules for voice and facial recognition. Does John's Pub have security cameras that records people's voices and faces? Probably. Where is that data stored? Is it streaming to an off-site hard drive? Is it a third-party security company managing all that footage? How can customers be sure what their voice and images are being used for? These are the types of questions you would want to be able to answer and map to the specific subcategory if you were being audited. It doesn't mean you're prohibited from recording voices and faces. The intent of this is to be able to prove that you're protecting that type of data appropriately and that you are performing due diligence while handling customer data. And some of you might argue that if you're in the public domain, you're out in public, there's no privacy laws, there's no expectations of privacy. But I would challenge you to research that a little further, see how many laws there are in regard to the abuse of those public images, because it might be legal to capture images in public, but it's not always legal to use those images for whatever you want. And that's what you need to be able to explain and prove through this subcategory. Not only that you're collecting these images and voices, but what you're doing with them and how you're protecting them. There is also a Federal Trade Commission Act that bans deceptive practices related to consumer marketing. So let's say John's Pub has an app, a mobile app, and within this app, I claim that all communications are secure and encrypted. But in reality, even the most basic cybersecurity concepts are not being enforced, and I'm not doing my due diligence to protect the data. Then the FTC could come after me with some massive penalties, including monetary fines and recurring compliance audits that might prevent me from running my business. You have to be able to back up your technical claims with proof. Now moving on to GV.OC 05, outcomes, capabilities, and services that the organization depends on are understood and communicated. Now this one speaks very closely to third-party vendor risks, which do overlap in real life. So they'll overlap a little bit among this framework as well. You'll see similar verbiage among the other functions and categories as we progress, but in this case it's referencing specific electronic dependencies that John's Pub might have on other companies. An easy way to identify some of these is to use the things that you listed in 03. For PCI, for example, does John's Pub use those little computers at each table so that people can place their orders or pay their tab? And if so, what level of impact would happen if all of those computers went down one day during rush hour? What about the mobile app? What if the mobile app went down? And I would agree with you if you said that if the mobile app went down, the cooks could still make their bangers and mash and the fish and chips, and the food would not stop moving. But even if Even if these incidents don't have direct immediate impact to the restaurant operation, the point of this subcategory is to have an awareness and a plan in place to mitigate the impact of that incident, or at least have communication channels in place with proper points of contact to recover from it. For example, I might just include a 2-minute slide during regular annual training or even new hire onboarding that speaks to our electronic systems and who to contact if one malfunctions. And that's it. That's all you really need to do to satisfy this subcategory. But it's also possible that your company or business really doesn't have any dependencies and you're totally independent. And if that's the case, that's okay. You can simply put not applicable and explain that you don't have any. Just be very sure of that, because if during an audit, if you did have dependencies that weren't identified during this self-assessment, this would be where they get caught and flagged as violations. All right, with all of that said, and now having walked through the first 2 examples of how to analyze subcategories, I'll show you the formal, official way that NIST provides to document our selections and information that I just presented. NIST provides what they call an Organizational Profile Template, and this is just an Excel spreadsheet with the rows being the subcategories and the columns being each different variable related to our business. Not all will be applicable, so not every cell needs to contain something. I just wanted you to see the original full version. And now I'm going to show you the stripped down version that I used for my Irish pub example, where I've only included the applicable columns. All right, so as you can see here, I've removed 6 columns that were very generic and duplicative of what I already had. You can compare it to the original full template if you need to, but these columns will be enough for this exercise. You'll notice I have highlighted the current and target priority. So first column is current priority. And again, since I'm only looking at subcategories 03 and 05 right now, let's just work with those. Let's say the current priority for our legal and contractual requirements right now is not very high. I can be flexible with our scale, so I can use hard numerical values like 1 through 10, or I can use low, medium, high, critical. I could even use colors if I wanted to. The idea for this column is just to document a snapshot in time while I'm doing this assessment. And you'll see the matching column called target priority over on the right, where I would decide whether I need to change this from current priority in order to either free up or dedicate more resources to this specific subcategory. As a restaurant owner, my initial current priority would probably be pretty low for this, since my main focus and business mission would be around the food and customers and not cybersecurity. So I put low here. But again, if you wanted to be really granular and you had many more priorities, you could use a numerical system and increment the priorities by numbers instead of a verbal criticality level. So instead of low, you might have 1, 2, or 3. I'm going to do the same thing for OC05 at the bottom in regard to third-party dependencies. Now, I don't really feel that a cash register, a security camera, or a restaurant jukebox outage would impact my ability to serve the food, which is the primary mission of my business. Before learning about this NIST framework and the importance of these subcategories, those impacts were considered low, so the priorities reflect that. However, as a restaurant owner, as I perform this assessment and become more educated on cybersecurity, I start to feel that my restaurant might be exposed a little bit more than I originally thought. It might be more vulnerable to cyber attacks than I initially planned for when I started this business. Therefore, I'm going to raise both of these subcategories that we have highlighted from low to medium. And I'm going to document this by placing my new target priority into the target priority column. Whether it be from low to medium or from 2 to 8 on a numerical scale, I just need to document the intended progression of maturity here. The next column, current status, is just a general statement about the current state of that subcategory. You can just put a one-liner here. Some examples would be, have not evaluated this yet, or meeting with Jonathan to discuss approach, or researching and organizing docs. Moving into the current policies, processes, and procedures, my focus here is to cite any current documents. You can just list the titles of the documents here that you already have. If you don't have any or know that you need some, that's where you'll list them in the target column. And they need to be related to the subcategory. So an example for OC03 could simply be PCI. And for OC05, we could put vendor SLAs, which would point the reader to any companies we work with that have service level agreements in place with us. Some target policies would include some of those new ones I discussed earlier, such as that Federal Trade Commissions Act that talked about security, camera footage, and facial recognition laws. This is something that was not on the radar when we set up John's Irish Pub. We were concerned with the food service, not technology. I'm going to keep repeating that throughout this series because that's the entire crux of this framework. It's to help non-IT companies think about their security posture and help implement it into their environment. And so for OC05, we want to improve our employee awareness of vendor dependencies. Remind them that a register or security camera might go down, and if it goes down, what the next steps are. The next column is pretty simple. It's roles and responsibilities. And for this one, we pretty much just need names here since the subcategories are already mapped in the first column. Depending on the size of the organization, you may want to have a primary and a secondary contact here. So for example, OC03, Jonathan could be the primary point of contact for incidents or questions related to this, and Bill could be secondary. Same for OC05. If you don't currently have this subcategory implemented at all, and you don't have anyone assigned just yet, leave it blank. If the subcategory is not required, you can put NA, not applicable. And if you wanted to update the contacts, that's what the target column is for. The next column, artifacts and evidence. I actually was supposed to remove this one for this example to keep it simple, and I didn't notice it was still here until I got to this moment. And it's been too much recording and editing to go back and remove it, so I'll just explain it and include it. But just know that there's no target column for this because I did remove that one. So anyway, current artifacts and evidence would capture the lowest level of proof of compliance for the associated subcategory. And this would point to things like data logs, files, business licenses, right? Printed training documents, and the actual locations of the legal contract documents. So we're talking about tangible artifacts, documentation. It's sort of an extension on the policies and procedures column where you would prove their existence. The target CSF tier is basically the maturity level you want to achieve on NIST scale of 1 through 4. So I'm going to move off this slide. I'm going to switch over to another slide to explain the cybersecurity framework tier levels in a little more detail. Okay, so these are the 4 implementation tiers. Tier 1 is partial, right? That's completely unprepared, completely uninformed about cybersecurity. Tier 2 is risk informed, and it represents a broad awareness and understanding of the risk, but no real implementation or steps taken to prevent it. And this is where I would place John's Pub for this example, right? Because we have an awareness of cybersecurity, but just nothing specific. And tier 3, repeatable, this is the goal tier, the target tier that what John's Pub is striving toward. It's a realistic step up. You could go from 2 to 4, but this is the natural step in between to be able to understand the cybersecurity program. It's a more formal, more documented and organized cybersecurity program. And tier 4 is adaptable and repeatable. And it's when you have your cybersecurity program fully optimized, and it's basically in cruise control mode with recurring reviews and updates. So now going back to our organizational profile template, we don't have a column for the current tier level, but we're going to plug in tier 3 for each of these OC03 and OC05. And again, we choose tier 3 because I'm a restaurant owner, and although I have not directly worked with technology and security requirements thus far, I have been exposed to cybersecurity concepts such as any news stories, phishing emails, or friends and family talking about being hacked. I have a broad awareness and understanding of the risks that are out there. I just haven't sat down and focused on them until now. So that's the thought process behind why we're moving from a tier 2 into a tier 3 level of program maturity. Notes column, self-explanatory. It could be for whatever you want, whether it's scheduling plans or an approval process. It's your own free block. All right, so that's it for those 2 subcategories. Now remember, we were working within the govern function and the organizational context category. And then those 2, within that there were 5 subcategories, but we were using 2 as the example, 03 and 05. So now you have an understanding of how to fill out your cybersecurity framework organizational profile template based on the choices you made as you continue your assessment through the functions, the categories, and the subcategories. So just as a recap of this video, together we walked through the govern function, its categories, and its subcategories. Then we analyzed 2 of the subcategories through the lens of our fictional Irish pub, and we documented our work within the organizational profile template. Now, everything I demonstrated in this lesson can be applied to any business or industry, so please think about how you would approach your own environment with the concepts that were presented here today. And you'll see that they can all be easily analyzed and implemented just as these were. And keep an eye out for my other videos that will do the same walkthrough for the other functions and the other categories. This one will probably be the longest since I included the initial walkthrough, a history of NIST and all that. But the rest will just be sort of cookie cutter presentations tailored around various categories and subcategories. For example, the next one that I'm going to be recording is still within the govern function, but it's going to be the risk management strategy category. And that one has 7 subcategories, of which we're going to select 2, and we're going to go through the thought process as a restaurant owner again. So you'll be able to see through all the functions and all the categories. I'm going to go through all of them. I'm going to use 2 examples from all of them. It should be a long series, but I think it'll be worth it to give you an idea of the approach and the logic and the thought process behind it. All right. Thank you for watching.